The gun goes off. You hear the bang. You see the smoke. And the President of the United States is still standing. Not because the assassin missed. He didn't miss. The man was 10 feet away, aiming directly at the President's back, and both of his pistols loaded, primed, tested, simply refused to fire. On one of the dampest, mistiest mornings Washington had seen that winter, on the steps of the United States Capitol, in front of a crowd of stunned onlookers, including one of the most famous frontiersmen in American history, Andrew Jackson survived an assassination attempt through what experts would later calculate were odds of 1 in 125,000. And then, Andrew Jackson, 67 years old, frail enough that he'd needed someone's arm just to walk into the building, raised his walking cane over his head and charged the gunman. That's who we're talking about. That's the energy of this whole era. The 8 years between 1829 and 1837 don't get the Netflix treatment they deserve. They don't sit in the cultural imagination the way the Revolution does, or the Civil War, or the World Wars. But what happened during those 8 years cracked the foundation of the American Republic in ways we're still living inside of right now. A war against a bank that nearly destroyed the economy. A constitutional crisis that brought civil war within inches of happening 30 years before it actually did. The forced displacement and death of tens of thousands of indigenous people in one of the largest ethnic cleansing operations in American history. And all of it driven by a single man, a man who carried a bullet lodged 2 inches from his heart for the last 39 years of his life. A man who killed another man in a duel over a horse race. A man whose pet parrot had to be escorted out of his own funeral for screaming profanity at the mourners. This is the age of Jackson, and nobody told you the full story. Hit subscribe. Seriously, if this already has you leaning forward, you're going to want to be here for where this goes. New videos drop every single day, and drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I'm genuinely curious to see how far this reaches, and we're just getting started. America in 1829 is a country that doesn't quite know what it wants to be yet. Think about what that means for a second. The Constitution is barely 40 years old. The men who wrote it are mostly dead, and the ones who are left are elderly and watching a country that has already grown far beyond anything they imagine. There are now 24 states. Settlers are pouring west across the Appalachians and into territories that aren't really territories yet, just wilderness with vague lines drawn on maps and distant cities. The Industrial Revolution is beginning to chew through New England. Cotton is turning the South into a single-crop economic machine that runs entirely on the labor of enslaved people. And the eastern cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, are filling up with a new kind of American, the working man, the immigrant, the person who built this country with his hands and his back and his 7 days a week labor, and who has never once seen a president who looked even remotely like him. The first 6 presidents of the United States were all, to put it simply, members of the elite. Virginia planters, Massachusetts intellectuals, men of education and property and connections. Even John Adams, who is sometimes remembered as a man of the people, was a Harvard-educated lawyer from a respectable New England family. The presidency, for its first 4 decades, was a gentleman's club, a very prestigious, very exclusive club, where admission required a certain kind of breeding that most Americans simply didn't have. Andrew Jackson broke the door down.
He was born in 1767, in a log cabin somewhere on the border between the Carolinas. Historians still argue about exactly which side of the state line. His father died before he was born. His mother was Irish immigrant stock, a woman who raised 3 boys in the kind of poverty that leaves marks. The Revolutionary War arrived when Jackson was 9 years old, and by the time he was 13, he and his brothers were in it. His brother Hugh died at the Battle of Stono Ferry. His brother Robert died of smallpox in a British prison camp. Andrew himself was captured, held prisoner, contracted smallpox,
and, in a moment that became one of the foundational myths of his life, was ordered by a British officer to clean his boots. He refused. The officer drew his sword and slashed him across the hand and across the face. Jackson carried the scar for the rest of his life. His mother died of cholera while nursing American prisoners of war on a British ship. She was in her early 40s. Andrew Jackson was 14, and he was alone. You don't come out of something like that normal. You come out of it with a specific kind of edge, a fury, a refusal to ever be humiliated again, a bone-deep conviction that the world is divided into people who submit and people who fight back. Jackson fought back. Every single time, for the rest of his life, he fought back. By his 30s, he was a lawyer, a judge, a congressman, a senator, a slave owner, a plantation master, and a man with a reputation for violence that both terrified and electrified the frontier communities of Tennessee. He had already fought more confrontations involving pistols and honor than most men saw in a lifetime, and in 1806, he fought the duel that should have killed him. The man's name was Charles Dickinson. He was, by all accounts, the best marksman in Tennessee, possibly the best in the entire country. He was a lawyer, a plantation owner, well-connected, socially respected. He and Jackson had a long-running feud over a horse race, over money, and over the kind of insults that, in the culture of the early American South, demanded satisfaction or destroyed a man's reputation entirely. What pushed it past the point of no return was this. Dickinson published a statement in a Nashville newspaper calling Jackson in print for everyone to read a worthless scoundrel, a poltroon, and a coward. He also made comments about Jackson's wife, Rachel. That was the last straw. The duel took place on May 30th, 1806, on the banks of a river in Kentucky. They crossed state lines because dueling was illegal in Tennessee. Dickinson brought his friends. He was so confident, so certain of his skill, that he reportedly demonstrated his marksmanship at stops along the road, putting bullet after bullet exactly where he aimed, as if the whole journey were a warm-up performance. He believed he was going to kill Andrew Jackson that morning. He had every reason to believe it. Jackson and his advisor had a plan. Because they knew Dickinson would fire first, and because they knew Dickinson's aim was extraordinary, they decided Jackson would simply absorb the shot. He wore an oversized coat, hoping it might throw off Dickinson's aim, and he resolved that no matter what happened when that first bullet hit him, he would stay on his feet long enough to shoot back. Dickinson fired first. The ball struck Jackson in the chest, 2 inches from his heart, breaking ribs. The force of it made Jackson grip the wound with his hand to slow the bleeding. A witness said the impact was visible, and Jackson stayed standing. He raised his pistol, fired. The mechanism stuck what they called a half-cock and didn't discharge. According to the Code Duello, the formal rules governing such things, the duel should have been over. Jackson looked at his weapon, looked at Dickinson standing across from him, and recocked the pistol. He fired again. This time, the bullet hit Dickinson in the chest. He died that evening. Jackson walked off the field under his own power. His boot was filling with blood. His second reportedly didn't realize how badly he was hurt until much later. The doctors examined the wound and made a decision that would define the next 4 decades of Jackson's life. The bullet was too close to the heart to be removed safely. They left it there. For 39 years, Andrew Jackson lived with a piece of lead lodged in his chest. It caused chronic pain. It caused abscesses. It caused lung problems that worsened as he aged. Every time he shook a foreign diplomat's hand, every time he banged his fist on the table in a cabinet meeting, every time he rode a horse or signed a bill into law, that bullet was there, a constant physical reminder of what he was capable of and what he had survived. You cannot understand the presidency of Andrew Jackson without understanding that body. A man who that badly wants to be standing at the end of every fight is going to govern in a very specific way. He is going to treat every political opponent as an enemy to be defeated, not a colleague to be negotiated with. He is going to mistake stubbornness for strength, and strength for righteousness. And sometimes, he is going to be exactly right. March 4th, 1829, Washington, D.C. The inauguration of Andrew Jackson as the 7th President of the United States. John Quincy Adams, the outgoing president, is so furious about losing in a campaign that had gotten genuinely ugly, with attacks on Jackson's wife and Jackson's past that still made the new president's jaw clench, that he refuses to attend. He packs his belongings, moves out of the White House, and leaves town without speaking to his successor. It is, in the long history of American presidential transitions, one of the more graceless exits. Jackson walks to the Capitol surrounded by thousands of people, not an organized escort, not a formal procession. Just thousands of Americans, farmers, soldiers, frontiersmen, working men, ordinary citizens who had traveled hundreds of miles from Tennessee, from Kentucky, from the backcountry, to see this, to see one of them take the oath. The ceremony itself is electric. Jackson gives a brief inaugural address, takes the oath, and the crowd erupts. And then, this is where it gets wild. They follow him to the White House. Not invited, not organized, just following. Tens of thousands of people pour into the mansion. They climb on the furniture, they smash the glassware, they track mud across floors that had seen Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, James Madison, James Monroe. The servants, desperate to save the building, finally drag the refreshment tubs full of whiskey punch out onto the White House lawn, hoping the crowd will follow. It works. The building empties out. Jackson himself has to be physically smuggled out through a back window and taken to a hotel to spend the first night of his presidency. One Washington aristocrat watching the scene wrote with barely concealed horror that this was the reign of King Mob, that democracy had literally run into the White House and broken things. The phrase was meant as a condemnation. Jackson's supporters treated it as a compliment. Here is what was actually happening. For the first time in the history of the Republic, people who had never seen themselves reflected in the office of the presidency felt that it belonged to them. Not because Jackson was one of them. He wasn't, not really, not anymore. He was a wealthy plantation owner with hundreds of enslaved people and a mansion in Tennessee. But he spoke like them. He fought like them. He hated the same things they hated. Elites with their connections, bankers with their condescension, institutions that seemed designed to keep the powerful powerful and the ordinary man permanently in his place. Jackson called his political philosophy democracy. His critics called it demagoguery. The truth, as it almost always is, sits somewhere in between and changes depending on who you were and what you stood to lose. The first thing Jackson did when he got to Washington, before the punch bowls, before the inaugural chaos, before any of it, was start thinking about the bank. Not any bank, the bank. The second bank of the United States. The institution that controlled the money supply of the entire country, that held federal deposits, that issued paper currency, and that was, in 1829, the most powerful financial entity in America. It was run by a man named Nicholas Biddle, Philadelphia-born, Princeton-educated, the kind of man who had been groomed his entire life for exactly this kind of power. Picture Biddle, and you'll understand why Jackson hated him on sight. He was everything Jackson wasn't. Cultivated, refined, European-educated, comfortable in the drawing rooms of the wealthy and the chambers of power. He wore fashionable clothes. He wrote elegant letters. He spoke with the authority of a man who had never doubted that he belonged exactly where he was. And he ran an institution that, by any reasonable measure, was the economic nervous system of the United States. In December 1829, in his very first annual address to Congress, a tradition that hadn't yet become the State of the Union address, Jackson attacked the bank. Not subtly, not diplomatically, He questioned its constitutionality. He questioned whether its paper money was actually sound. He suggested it had failed in the great end of establishing a uniform and sound currency. His own supporters were shocked. Biddle was shocked. Everyone was shocked, because the bank, whatever its problems, was working. The economy was functioning. The currency was relatively stable. Attacking the bank in 1829 was a little like a new president walking into the Oval Office and immediately declaring war on the Federal Reserve. Startling doesn't quite cover it, but Jackson wasn't operating on economic theory.
He was operating on instinct, on ideology, and on a specific and deeply personal understanding of who power in America belonged to. And his instinct said, this institution, controlled by private men with connections to foreign money and wealthy elites, with the power to extend or withhold credit based on political loyalty, this institution is the enemy of the ordinary American, the enemy of the farmer in Kentucky who needs a loan and can't get one because he's not friends with the right people, the enemy of the frontier businessman who can't compete because the big Eastern merchants have a direct line to the bank's directors. Was he right? Partially. The bank did have real problems. It had played favorites. It had used its influence in elections. Biddle had spent what would be equivalent to millions of dollars in today's money, printing pamphlets, lobbying Congress, and extending loans to newspaper editors who supported the bank's position. That's not a neutral financial institution. That's a political actor dressed up as an economic one. But Jackson's solution, his plan for what to replace the bank with, was going to cause a disaster. He just didn't know it yet. The man who pushed the re-charter strategy was Henry Clay. Clay, Jackson's great enemy, one of the most brilliant political tacticians of the era, calculated that he could use the bank as a weapon in the 1832 election. The bank's charter wasn't due to expire until 1836, but Clay convinced Biddle to apply for early re-charter in 1832, right before the election. The calculation was simple. Jackson wouldn't dare veto it in an election year, and if he did veto it, he would look like a reckless radical, and the voters would punish him. They handed Jackson the veto with a bow on it. On July 10, 1832, Jackson vetoed the re-charter bill, and the message he sent back to Congress was not a dry legal document. It was a political manifesto. He called the bank a monster. He said it served the few at the expense of the many. He accused it of being a tool of the rich and powerful against the humble members of society. He made it about class, about democracy, about who America was supposed to be for. He won the election in a landslide. The veto message was so effective as a political document that historians still study it today. But Clay had miscalculated something more fundamental than the politics. He had assumed Jackson would fight the bank and lose, or fight it and win, and then move on. He didn't understand that for Jackson, winning was never enough. Winning just meant it was time to press harder. While the bank war was building toward its climax, something else was happening in South Carolina that was, if anything, even more dangerous. It started with a tariff, not the most dramatic sentence in the English language, but stay with it. In 1828, Congress passed what Southerners immediately and bitterly called the Tariff of Abominations. It was a protective tariff, taxes on imported goods designed to protect northern manufacturers. Great for the factories of New England, catastrophic for the South. Southern states imported enormous quantities of manufactured goods and exported raw materials, particularly cotton. A tariff on imports meant they paid more for everything they bought while getting nothing in return. South Carolina, which was already economically squeezed as cotton prices fell, felt like it was being taxed to subsidize industries in states that had nothing to do with them. Here's the part that makes this genuinely explosive. John C. Calhoun, Jackson's own vice president, the man elected alongside him on the same ticket, was secretly writing the intellectual case for why South Carolina didn't have to put up with it. Calhoun's argument was elegant and deeply dangerous.
He argued that the federal government was a compact among the states.
That individual states, as the original parties to that compact, retained the right to declare federal laws that violated the Constitution to be null and void within their borders. Nullification, he called it. If a state decided a law was unconstitutional, that state could simply refuse to enforce it. The federal government could do nothing about it. If that logic sounds familiar, it should. It is the same logic that will eventually be used to justify secession. The nullification crisis of 1832 is not a prelude to the Civil War. It is a first draft of it, written 30 years early. Calhoun published his argument anonymously. Jackson found out who wrote it, and the friendship between the president and his vice president, already strained by a dozen smaller conflicts, shattered completely. The crisis came to a head in the fall of 1832. South Carolina held a convention and passed the Ordinance of Nullification. They declared the 1828 tariff and the 1832 tariff, which Congress had passed to try to lower rates slightly, null and void within South Carolina's borders. They said if the federal government tried to collect the tariff by force, South Carolina would leave the Union. The governor called for 10,000 volunteers to defend the state. Jackson's response was immediate and absolute. He issued the Nullification Proclamation in December 1832. He did not mince words. He said that no state had the right to nullify federal law. He said that the theory of nullification was incompatible with the existence of the United States as a nation. He said that secession was treason. And he got Congress to pass the Force Bill, explicit legal authority to use the military to enforce federal law in South Carolina if it came to that. He also, privately, made clear in the most Jackson way possible what he intended to do if it did come to that. He let it be known that he planned to personally lead troops into South Carolina and hang the leaders of the nullification movement. He wasn't bluffing. Anyone who had watched Andrew Jackson operate for the previous decade knew that he was not bluffing. The crisis was ultimately resolved not through force, but through deal-making. Henry Clay, yes, the same Clay who had tried to use the bank recharter against Jackson, who was simultaneously one of Jackson's greatest enemies and one of the most indispensable political operators of the era, negotiated a compromise tariff that gradually lowered rates over several years. South Carolina accepted the compromise, withdrew the Ordinance of Nullification, and quietly moved on. But notice what actually happened here. The federal government backed down on the substance. It lowered the tariff, while standing firm on the principle. South Carolina didn't win, but it didn't lose in a way that humiliated it enough to push it into actual secession. The crisis was diffused, and the question it raised, can a state nullify a federal law, was answered, officially, with an emphatic no. Jackson had drawn the line clearly. What he didn't see, or refused to see, was what was underneath the tariff argument. The nullifiers in South Carolina weren't just angry about taxes on imported goods. They were afraid. Abolitionism was growing in the North. Pamphlets criticizing slavery were circulating. The Southern slave economy felt, correctly, that it was increasingly surrounded by people who wanted to destroy it. The tariff was the immediate grievance. The real fear was deeper, older, and would not be resolved by any compromise tariff. The Civil War didn't start in 1861. It started accumulating in 1832. Jackson bought time. He didn't buy a solution. And now we have to talk about the thing that sits at the center of Jackson's legacy, like a stone you can't move, no matter how much of the rest of the story you want to tell. In 1829, gold was discovered on Cherokee land in northern Georgia. Real gold. Enough of it to trigger what became the first major gold rush in American history, predating California by 20 years. And it didn't happen on empty land. It happened on land that belonged, by treaty and by occupation stretching back centuries, to the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee were not, by 1829,
living the way European settlers imagined indigenous people lived. They had schools and newspapers and a written language of their own, an alphabet created by a man named Sequoyah, which allowed a largely illiterate people to become, within a few years, almost entirely literate in their own language. They had a constitutional government modeled on the American one. They had lawyers and merchants and clergy. They had built, within the terms of the civilization that surrounded them, a nation, and a sophisticated, functioning one. None of it mattered. Georgia declared that Cherokee law was void, that Cherokee land was state land, that the Cherokee, as non-citizens, had no rights that a white man was bound to respect. And Jackson, who as a general had spent years fighting against and alongside various native nations, and who had very definite views about which way that history was supposed to go, supported them. In May 1830, Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. It authorized the federal government to negotiate treaties to relocate Native American tribes from their ancestral lands east of the Mississippi River to designated territory further west. The language was careful. The law said the relocations should be voluntary. It said there should be fair compensation. It said the government would provide support for the journey. None of those provisions were real. The Cherokee took the fight to the Supreme Court. They won. Chief Justice John Marshall ruled in Worcester versus Georgia in 1832 that Georgia's laws had no force on Cherokee land, that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct political community with its own territory, and that the state of Georgia had no jurisdiction there. Jackson's response to the Supreme Court's ruling on behalf of the Cherokee Nation is one of the most consequential acts of constitutional defiance in American presidential history. He refused to enforce it. Whether he said the exact words that have been attributed to him, John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. Historians debate. But the substance of his position is not in doubt. He simply declined to act on the court's ruling. A sitting president handed a Supreme Court decision protecting the rights of American citizens under federal law, put that decision in a drawer, and left it there. The Cherokee continued to resist. They refused to sign removal treaties. They petitioned Congress. They appealed to the American public. In 1835, a small and unrepresentative faction of Cherokee leaders, without authorization from the Cherokee National Council or from Principal Chief John Ross, signed the Treaty of New Echota, agreeing to removal. The treaty was fraudulent by any reasonable definition. It was negotiated with people who had no authority to sign it, representing a position that the vast majority of the Cherokee people had explicitly rejected. The U.S. Senate ratified it by a single vote. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote to President Van Buren Jackson's successor that if the treaty were enforced, it would be a crime that will go down to posterity to our lasting dishonor. Sam Houston, former governor of Tennessee, and a man who had lived among the Cherokee himself, condemned it publicly. None of that stopped what happened next. In the fall and winter of 1838 and 1839, the U.S. Army, under General Winfield Scott, rounded up approximately 13,000 Cherokee at bayonet point. They were held in stockades in the Tennessee heat, while their homes were looted behind them, and their graves were robbed for silver ornaments. Then they were marched more than 1,000 miles west toward Oklahoma. The march took place in the wrong season, with insufficient supplies, in weather that turned brutal. Whooping cough moved through the columns. Typhus, dysentery, cholera, starvation. The sick and the dying were left by the road. Children died in their mothers' arms and were buried in shallow graves along the route. At a river crossing in Illinois, the ferry operator charged $1 a head, nearly 100 times his normal rate, to let starving, dying people cross. They waited in the cold under a rock bluff called Mantle Rock until he felt like letting them pass. Approximately a quarter of the Cherokee who began that march did not reach the end of it. A soldier who witnessed it, a man who would later fight in the Civil War and see thousands of men killed in battle, said that the Cherokee removal was the cruelest thing he had ever seen in his life. Jackson had already left office when the worst of it happened. The details of the march were Van Buren's to answer for, but the architecture of the catastrophe, the law, the legal framework, the political decisions, the refusal to enforce the Supreme Court's ruling, that was all Jackson. And he lived another 8 years after leaving the presidency. He read the newspapers. He knew what had happened on that march. He never expressed regret for any of it. Back in Washington, in the winter of 1835, the war with the bank was in its final stages, and something happened that reframed everything. Jackson had moved beyond the veto. After his re-election, seeing his second term as a mandate to finish what he'd started, he ordered the removal of all federal deposits from the Second Bank of the United States. He wanted to scatter the money into dozens of state banks, what his opponents immediately called pet banks, because they suspected Jackson was just giving the federal money to institutions friendly to him politically. When his Treasury Secretary refused the order, Jackson fired him.
Then he fired the next Treasury Secretary, who also refused. The third one, Roger Taney, agreed. The deposits were moved. The Senate, led by Jackson's enemies Clay, Calhoun, Daniel Webster, three of the most formidable political minds of the era operating in rare and furious alignment, voted to censure the President of the United States. The first, and for a very long time, the only time in American history that the Senate formally rebuked a sitting president by name. Jackson protested that the censure was unconstitutional. He was almost certainly right about that. He also had it formally expunged from the Senate record, years later when his supporters finally won a Senate majority. The whole episode felt, and was, deeply personal. Biddle fought back. With the federal deposits gone, he began calling in loans restricting credit to state banks, squeezing the money supply, trying to create the very economic distress he had been accused of having the power to create. It worked, temporarily. There was a credit crunch. Businesses complained. Merchants complained. Even some Jackson supporters went to the White House demanding the president back down and restore the bank. Jackson called them into his office. He listened to their complaints. And then he said, and this is the quote that defines him, that tells you everything about both his strength and his limitations. Andrew Jackson never retreats. He didn't retreat. The bank's charter expired in 1836. Biddle obtained a Pennsylvania state charter, and the institution staggered on for a few more years before finally collapsing in 1841. Jackson had won. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because in the middle of all of this, the bank war, the nullification standoff, the Cherokee removal, something happened that had never happened in the history of the American presidency. Something that puts into sharp focus just how many enemies a man accumulates when he governs the way Andrew Jackson governed. January 30th, 1835.
The morning of the assassination attempt. Jackson is at the United States Capitol for the funeral of a South Carolina congressman named Warren Davis. He is 67 years old, and he looks it. Rail thin, pale, his white hair gone wild, leaning on the arm of his Treasury Secretary just to get through the door. He has survived duels, wars, and 7 years of political combat brutal enough to break most men twice his age. He looks, one witness writes, as though he is scarcely able to go through with the ceremony. Outside, waiting near one of the pillars at the east portico, is a man named Richard Lawrence. He is a British-born house painter, unemployed, and he has been losing his mind for the better part of a year. He is convinced that he is the rightful king of England. He is convinced that Andrew Jackson, King Andrew, as his opponents mockingly called him, is the only thing standing between him and his royal inheritance. He has been watching Jackson's movements for weeks. His neighbors have seen him sitting in his paint shop, laughing to himself, muttering about the president. On the morning of the assassination attempt, he gets up, leaves the shop, and tells someone nearby, "I'll be damned if I don't do it." Jackson exits the Capitol, moving through the rotunda, heading toward the east door. Lawrence is waiting. When Jackson passes, Lawrence steps forward, raises a single-shot percussion cap pistol, and aims at the president's back from a distance of roughly 10 feet. He pulls the trigger. The cap explodes. You hear the bang, you see the smoke, but the powder in the barrel fails to ignite. Misfire. In the brief moment of shock and confusion that follows, something extraordinary happens. Andrew Jackson, a man who is already, physically, barely holding himself together, does not take cover. He does not fall back. He does not wait for aides to surround him. He raises his walking cane over his head and charges the man who just tried to shoot him.
Lawrence has a second pistol. He raises it, takes aim at the president, who is now advancing toward him at a dead run with a cane raised over his head, and pulls the trigger. At nearly point-blank range, second misfire. The crowd erupts. Bystanders tackle Lawrence to the ground. The man pulling the president back from the melee, reportedly, is Davy Crockett, former Tennessee congressman, professional American legend, barely 14 months away from dying at the Alamo, who happened to be in the crowd that morning. Jackson continues trying to get at Lawrence with the cane. It takes several people physically restraining him to stop. Later, when experts examine Lawrence's pistols, both fire on the first attempt without any malfunction. They are loaded properly. There is nothing wrong with them. The only explanation anyone can offer is the weather. It was damp, misty, the kind of morning that can cause black powder to absorb just enough moisture to refuse to ignite. The odds of both guns failing under those conditions were calculated at 125,000 to 1. Jackson had survived something that shouldn't have been survivable. He had been saved by weather, by chance, by a statistical near impossibility, and his response to immediately charge the man with a cane said everything about who he was and how he moved through the world. He was also, predictably, convinced it was a conspiracy. He blamed his political enemies. He publicly accused a Mississippi senator named George Poindexter, who had once employed Lawrence as a painter, of being the mastermind. There was no evidence. Lawrence was simply insane. His trial, a few months later, lasted 5 minutes before the jury returned a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. Lawrence spent the rest of his life in an asylum. At one point during the trial, when the prosecutor Francis Scott Key, the man who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, tried to question him, Lawrence turned to the jury and said, "It is for me, gentlemen, to pass judgment on you, and not you upon me." The whole proceeding had a very Jacksonian energy, if you think about it. The winter of 1836 is when the wheels start to come off. Not dramatically, not all at once. That's the thing about economic catastrophes. They almost never announce themselves. They build quietly, the way a crack builds in a dam wall, invisible from the outside, spreading through the structure until the morning when the whole thing gives way and everyone acts surprised, even though, if they'd been paying attention, the warning signs were everywhere. Jackson had destroyed the bank. He had scattered the federal deposits into state banks across the country, dozens of them in every region, with wildly different standards, different practices, different degrees of recklessness. Without the Second Bank of the United States to act as a regulating force, without any central authority enforcing discipline on the money supply, the state banks did what unregulated banks in every era of American history inevitably do. They ran wild. They printed paper money, enormous quantities of it. They extended credit generously, enthusiastically, to anyone who asked, and many who didn't. Land speculation exploded, particularly in the West, where men were buying and selling frontier territory the way people in a later era would trade penny stocks on borrowed money, on the assumption that prices would always go higher, but the boom would never end. The whole system was floating on paper promises and collective optimism, and it worked, just as long as everyone agreed to keep believing in it. Jackson saw some of this. He didn't like paper money. On principle. He was, in his bones, a hard money man, a gold and silver man, someone who believed that real value had to be physical, tangible, metal you could hold in your hand. So, in the summer of 1836,
He did something that made total sense as ideology and was an economic hand grenade as policy. He issued the Specie Circular. The order was simple. Anyone buying federal land in the West had to pay in gold or silver. No more paper. No more banknotes. Hard money only. The effects were immediate and catastrophic. Paper money, which had been circulating as the de facto currency of the Western land boom, suddenly looked like what it actually was: pieces of paper backed by banks that didn't have enough gold or silver to honor them. Speculators who had borrowed money to buy land couldn't get loans anymore. Land prices began to fall. Banks began to fail. Credit dried up. The whole beautiful, delusional construction of the speculative boom began to unravel. And then, almost simultaneously, the Bank of England made its own decision that had nothing to do with American domestic politics, but hit the American economy like a second hammer blow. The British banks, concerned about their own exposure to American credit, dramatically tightened their lending. American businesses that had borrowed in London, and there were many, because British capital had been flowing into the American economy for years, suddenly found their credit lines cut. Hard currency began draining out of American banks as foreign debts came due. The gold and silver that Jackson's Specie Circular demanded people use to buy land was the same gold and silver that was being pulled out of the system to pay British creditors. The timing was almost comically precise in its cruelty. Jackson left office on March 4, 1837. The Panic of 1837 began in May.
His successor, Martin Van Buren, a man of genuine intelligence and political skill who had been, throughout Jackson's presidency, one of his closest advisors and architects of his political coalition, walked into the White House and directly into the worst economic crisis the United States had experienced since independence. Banks failed by the hundreds, businesses collapsed, unemployment spread through the cities, prices fell, wages fell. The depression that followed lasted for years. Some historians argue it didn't fully resolve until the mid-1840s. Van Buren, who had won the presidency largely on the strength of Jackson's endorsement and the popularity of Jackson's administration, became the face of an economic catastrophe he had partially helped create and had no good tools to fix. Jackson, watching from his Tennessee plantation, did what Jackson always did. He identified enemies. He blamed the banks. He blamed Biddle. He blamed foreign creditors. He blamed the speculators. He blamed everyone, except the Specie Circular, except his decision to dismantle the regulatory structure of the national banking system without having anything coherent to replace it with, except the 8 years of policy that had systematically removed every brake on the very speculation he now condemned. He was not entirely wrong to assign blame elsewhere. The Panic of 1837 had multiple causes, and Jackson's decisions were only some of them. But the man who had declared war on the monster bank, who had told the American people that destroying it was a victory for the common man, now watched those same common men, the farmers, the workers, the frontier settlers, lose their savings, their land, their livelihoods in the wreckage. The common man paid for the bank war. He almost always does, in one form or another. The powerful fight their battles, and the ordinary people absorb the consequences. Jackson never quite saw it that way. He never quite could. There is a story about Jackson in the censure that tells you something essential about the texture of his personality. When the Senate passed its resolution of censure in 1834, formally rebuking him for removing the federal deposits without proper authorization, Jackson was furious, in the way that only Jackson could be furious. Completely, physically, at a cellular level. He wrote a formal protest to the Senate, arguing that the censure was unconstitutional, that the Senate had essentially accused him of a crime without giving him the ability to defend himself in a proper proceeding. Legally, he had a point. But the thing that reveals the man is what he did about it for the next 3 years. He didn't let it go.
He didn't file the protest and move on. He spent 3 years of his second term making sure his Senate allies, led by Thomas Hart Benton, who had once shot Jackson in a hotel brawl and later become one of his most ferocious defenders, which is its own extraordinary story, systematically worked toward a Senate majority that could formally expunge the censure from the record. In January 1837, with 2 months left in his presidency, they succeeded. The Senate voted to expunge the censure. The clerk took the Senate journal, drew black lines around the resolution, and wrote across it in large letters, "Expunged, by order of the Senate." Jackson, when he heard the news, wept. Not from sentiment exactly, or not only from sentiment, from vindication, from the satisfaction of a man who had spent 3 years, across an entire second term of the presidency, pursuing the erasure of a document that most people had largely forgotten about. That's the personality you're dealing with. An enemy made is an enemy pursued. A wrong done is a wrong that will be answered, no matter how long it takes, no matter how much energy it requires. Jackson could hold a grudge, the way other men hold a job, with total commitment, indefinitely, as a central organizing principle of daily life.
He had a list of enemies that, by the end of his presidency, had grown so long it was almost a form of autobiography. Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, Nicholas Biddle, Daniel Webster, the Second Bank of the United States, the Nullifiers, the British, various specific individuals who had said various specific things about him or Rachel over the years that he had cataloged with the precision of an accountant and the passion of someone who takes everything personally. Because he genuinely did take everything personally. At the very end of his presidency, someone asked him if he had any regrets. He thought about it seriously. He said that yes, he had 2 regrets from his time in office. He regretted that he had been unable to shoot Henry Clay, and he regretted that he had been unable to hang John C. Calhoun. He wasn't being metaphorical. Or rather, he may have been, slightly, by that point, but there was a version of Andrew Jackson who would have meant that sentence in the most literal possible way, and everyone in the room knew it. Let's step back for a moment from the specific events and look at what Jackson actually built. Because the age of Jackson is not just a collection of crises and confrontations. It is the origin story of modern American politics in ways that go so deep, most people don't even notice them. Before Jackson, American political campaigns were largely conducted among elites. Candidates didn't really campaign. It was considered undignified to openly seek office. The voters who mattered were men of property. Political organizing happened in drawing rooms and legislative halls and gentlemen's clubs. The common man was a rhetorical device that politicians invoked and largely ignored. Jackson changed all of that. His 1828 campaign was the first genuinely mass-market presidential campaign in American history. His supporters organized rallies, parades, barbecues. They created hickory pole clubs. Hickory, like old hickory, get it? Across the country. They printed campaign materials. They knocked on doors. They turned political participation into something that felt exciting, communal, even festive, and the turnout reflected it. The number of men who voted in 1828 was roughly 3 times higher than in 1824. An enormous portion of the American electorate that had been dormant or alienated or simply uninterested suddenly showed up. Jackson also built the modern Democratic Party. The coalition he assembled, Southern planters, Western settlers, Northern working men, immigrants, was the template for democratic coalitions for generations to come. More than that, he created the idea that a political party should be a fighting organization, not a polite debating society. You vote for your people fight for you. Your enemies are their enemies. The spoils system, the practice of rewarding political supporters with government jobs when your candidate wins, was not invented by Jackson,
but it was formalized and defended by him, with a philosophical clarity it had never had before. He argued that rotation in office was democratic, that letting men hold government jobs indefinitely created an entrenched bureaucratic class with its own interests. Better to clear them out when leadership changed and start fresh. The phrase, "to the victor go the spoils," became associated with his administration. The spoils system would eventually corrupt American government so thoroughly that it took an assassination. President Garfield, killed by a disappointed office seeker 50 years later, to finally produce civil service reform. He expanded the power of the presidency in ways that no one before him had tried. He vetoed more bills than all previous presidents combined, and he made no apology for it. His predecessors had used the veto sparingly, mostly when they believed a bill was unconstitutional. Jackson vetoed things he simply disagreed with. He used the veto as a policy tool.
He was the first president to do that, and every president since has done the same. The modern presidency, the powerful, assertive, unilateral executive office that you know today, is in significant part Jackson's invention. He defied the Supreme Court. In an era when the court was still establishing its authority, when the question of what happened if a president simply refused to enforce a ruling was genuinely unresolved, Jackson answered that question. The answer was, nothing happens, if the president doesn't want anything to happen. That precedent that the executive branch can simply decline to enforce judicial decisions it finds inconvenient has haunted American constitutional law ever since. He saved the Union from its first secession crisis. That is real, and it matters. And it would have been far more widely celebrated if the same Union he saved hadn't lurched toward catastrophic civil war within 30 years of his leaving office, along the very fault lines his presidency both revealed and deepened. He created Jacksonian democracy, the belief that government should serve the ordinary man, that elites and concentrated power and privilege are the enemies of freedom, that the common people are the true foundation of Republican self-government. That ideology runs, in various forms, through American political history all the way to the present day. It is a real and powerful democratic impulse. It is also easily weaponized by demagogues, easily twisted into populism that serves the powerful while claiming to serve the powerless. Jackson himself was the first demonstration of both possibilities simultaneously, and he cleared out the eastern half of the continent for white settlement by forcing tens of thousands of Native Americans off their land and onto a death march. That fact doesn't diminish the other things, but it doesn't get to disappear into footnotes either. You don't get to hold both parts of that legacy at arm's length and pretend they exist in separate compartments. They were produced by the same man, with the same convictions, driven by the same definition of who the people were, a definition that had very clear edges, and a lot of people on the wrong side of them. Jackson left Washington in March 1837. He went home to the Hermitage, his plantation outside Nashville, and he lived there for the next 8 years. He was not a quiet retiree. He wrote letters constantly. He gave advice to Democratic politicians constantly. He stayed engaged with politics right up until the end of his life, backing candidates, denouncing enemies, occasionally threatening to get back into the fight personally if the situation demanded it. He was old. He was sick. His body was betraying him in a dozen different ways. The bullet still in his chest, the abscesses, the lung problems, the tremors, and none of it slowed him down much. He was also, in those years, the keeper of a bird. The parrot's name was Pole. It was an African gray, the kind of bird that can live for decades, that can learn hundreds of words, that mimics not just sounds but cadences, not just words, but the specific tonal signatures of specific voices. Jackson had bought Pole originally as a gift for his wife, Rachel, but Rachel died in December 1828, just weeks before he was inaugurated, a death that Jackson blamed, at least partially, on the stress of the brutal election campaign and the attacks on her character that it had produced.
Pole outlived her. Jackson kept the bird at the Hermitage and treated it with the kind of affection he rarely showed toward anything else. He wrote letters asking after Pole's health when he was away from the plantation. His nephew wrote back that Pole was fat and saucy, which, if you know anything about African greys, is probably exactly right.
The bird was present for the entire Jackson presidency, the entire post-presidential period, all 8 years at the Hermitage. It heard Jackson argue, complain, threaten, curse, rail against his enemies, talk to his visitors, dictate his correspondence, issue his pronouncements. It was, in the most literal possible sense, a witness to the man. African greys learn what they hear. They don't editorialize. They don't curate. They absorb their environment and reproduce it. If Andrew Jackson's household vocabulary ran to the colorful, and everyone who knew him attested that it very much did, then Pole's vocabulary ran to the colorful. That was simply the reality of what the bird had been immersed in for nearly 20 years. Jackson died on June 8, 1845. He was 78 years old. His body had been trying to kill him for most of his adult life. The bullet, the old wounds, the malaria that came back again and again, the lung problems that worsened with every year, and it finally succeeded. Thousands of people gathered at the Hermitage to pay their respects. Politicians and generals and ordinary citizens from across Tennessee and beyond made the journey to the plantation. It was, by all accounts, a dignified and somber occasion, with the weight of ceremony appropriate to the death of a former president. The funeral service was about to begin, and Pole, the parrot, present in the room with the assembled mourners, became aware of the crowd, the noise, the strangeness of so many people gathered in the space that had always belonged, essentially, to one man and his household. The bird became agitated, and then the bird began to do what the bird had learned to do. The Reverend William Menifee Normant, who was presiding at the service, recorded what happened in his memoirs. He wrote that before the sermon even began, while the crowd was still gathering, a wicked parrot that was a household pet got excited and commenced swearing so loud and long as to disturb the people, and had to be carried from the house. The Reverend went on to note that Paul had been excited by the multitude and had let loose perfect gusts of cuss words. The assembled mourners, politicians, generals, clergy, ladies of society in their best black, were, in his account, horrified and awed at the bird's lack of reverence. Paul was removed from the building. The service continued. Andrew Jackson was buried in the garden of his plantation, beside Rachel. The parrot had to be escorted out of the man's own funeral for screaming profanity at the mourners. If you were going to write a one-paragraph summary of who Andrew Jackson was, the raw, unfiltered energy of him, the way his personality seeped into everything around him, the way he left his mark on every person and institution and creature that came within his orbit, you could not do better than that image. The bird learned from the man, and the man's last contribution to his own funeral was a parrot delivering profanity to the assembled dignitaries of the American South, Old Hickory to the end. Here is what we are left with. Andrew Jackson is buried at the Hermitage. His face appears on the $20 bill. There are statues of him in cities across America. He has a square named after him across the street from the White House. And for about as long as anyone can remember, there has been an argument about what to do with all of it, whether the honors are appropriate, whether the man deserves to be remembered the way he has been remembered, whether it is possible to hold both the Democratic legacy and the Trail of Tears in the same frame and make an honest accounting. The honest accounting, if you're willing to make it, looks something like this. He created the conditions under which ordinary Americans felt, for the first time, that the government was theirs. That is not a small thing. In a country that had spent its first 40 years being run by a narrow class of educated elites, the democratization of the presidency, the sense that the White House belonged to the people, not the aristocracy, was transformative. It had real consequences for how Americans understood their relationship to power.
and most of those consequences were good. He also built that democratic feeling on an enormous exclusion. The common man Jackson championed was a white man. The expansion of democracy he presided over ran parallel to the most systematic displacement of indigenous people in the country's history, to the entrenchment of slavery as an economic system, to the legal and physical exclusion of vast categories of Americans from the democratic project entirely. You cannot call it democracy and leave that out. He preserved the Union when it was genuinely at risk of fracturing in 1832. He drew the line on nullification clearly and enforced it with the threat of military force. That precedent that the federal government is supreme, that states cannot unilaterally void federal law, matters enormously. Without that precedent, it is hard to imagine how Lincoln navigates 1861. The Union Jackson preserved was a flawed and compromised and deeply unjust thing, but it was also the vessel in which, eventually, the expansion of American rights and freedoms would take place. You can't quite throw it away. He also, in the Bank War, removed a regulatory structure without replacing it with anything coherent, and the economic disaster that followed the Panic of 1837, the depression that lasted years, was paid for by the ordinary Americans he claimed to be fighting for. The common man was the collateral damage of Jackson's victory over the monster bank. The irony is bitter, and it is not minor. He defied a Supreme Court ruling to allow the Trail of Tears to proceed. In terms of constitutional governance, this may be his most consequential act, not because it was the most dramatic, but because it established something terrifying, that the executive branch can simply choose not to enforce judicial decisions it finds inconvenient, that the checks and balances depend ultimately on the good faith of the people inside them. And that good faith, in Andrew Jackson's case, was always conditional. The questions Jackson raised never got answered, they just got bigger. Who does democracy belong to? Who is the common man that the government is supposed to serve? What happens when the will of the majority collides with the rights of a minority, whether that minority is Native Americans, or South Carolinians, or bankers, or anyone else? What is the relationship between the executive branch and the other two? Can a president ignore the courts? Can a president ignore the Congress? How much power is too much power, and who gets to decide? Jackson answered all of these questions. He answered them loudly, decisively, and with the full force of his personality and the office he held. And almost none of his answers were final. Almost none of them stuck. They just shifted the argument forward in time and made it more urgent. The Civil War was not caused by Andrew Jackson, but the fissure lines it ran along between North and South, between federal and state authority, between those who believed the Union was permanent and those who believed states could leave it, those fissure lines were visible in 1832 and 1833, during the nullification crisis, in exactly the shape they would take 30 years later. Jackson sealed them over with a compromised tariff and a threat of military force, and his absolute, thunderous will to hold the thing together. But he didn't heal them. Nobody healed them. They ran underground, and they kept running until the ground finally gave way. The banking question he settled was unsettled almost immediately. The United States spent the rest of the 19th century without a central bank, subject to financial panics roughly every decade or so, until the Federal Reserve was created in 1913. The institution he destroyed took 80 years to be reinvented in a form that could survive. The democratic energy he unleashed, the sense that ordinary people have a right to the machinery of government, that the powerful and the privileged are the natural enemies of the common man, that a strong leader who speaks the language of the street and fights the enemies of the people is exactly what democracy needs. That energy is still running. You can feel it in the temperature of American politics right now, in the hostility to institutions, in the suspicion of expertise, in the cult of the fighter politician who doesn't back down. Jackson didn't invent those impulses. They were there before him, but he gave them shape, and a face, and a mythology, and a playbook that has been running ever since. There is one last thing worth sitting with. Rachel Jackson died in December 1828, weeks before her husband was inaugurated. She had been, by all accounts, the one person in the world who could reach him, the one person whose opinion he genuinely cared about, whose judgment he trusted, whose presence made the fury inside him quiet down. She was his equal in stubbornness and his better in kindness. He carried her portrait everywhere he went during his presidency. He slept with it on the nightstand. When he died, 17 years after her, he was buried beside her in the garden, the way he had asked to be. The marriage had been complicated by scandal from the beginning. Questions about the timing of her divorce from her first husband, questions that followed them both for decades, and that Jackson fought, sometimes literally, whenever someone raised them in public. He fought duels over her honor. He bore insults over her name, that he collected the way other men collect grievances, which is to say, carefully and permanently. He believed, with a ferocity that was almost frightening, that the campaign attacks on Rachel in 1828 had broken her health and contributed to her death. He never forgave the men he held responsible, not for a single day of the remaining 17 years of his life. For all of his brutality, all of his cruelty, all of the damage he caused, and it was real and it was vast. He loved one person, completely and irreversibly, and she was gone before he got to the part of his life that history would remember him for. That doesn't excuse anything. It doesn't balance the ledger. History doesn't work that way. And sentimentalizing powerful men because they loved their wives is one of the oldest tricks in the book of avoiding accountability. But it's part of the picture. The rage that drove everything the bank war, the nullification showdown, the Indian removal, the duels, the enemies lists, the absolute refusal to ever back down. Some of it was politics, some of it was ideology, and some of it was a man who had been losing people since he was 9 years old and had decided, somewhere along the way, that the only response to a world that took everything from you was to fight it, continuously, ferociously, without rest, until you couldn't anymore. He fought until the very end. He wrote political letters from his sickbed. He advised Democratic candidates from the Hermitage when he could barely lift a pen. He died in June 1845 and was buried in the garden he had walked through with Rachel, beside the roses she had planted. And Poll, the parrot, screamed profanity at the mourners. And the 20 questions his presidency raised are still, right now, in this moment, being answered and re-answered and argued over in legislatures and courtrooms and on screens in everybody's pocket. That's the age of Jackson. A young country, barely 60 years old, trying to figure out what it wanted to be, a democracy or an empire, a government of the many or a government of the powerful, dressed up in the language of the many, and finding, as every generation since has found, that the answer is never simple, and the argument is never over. We're still in it. We never left.